Cuéntame qué te trae por aquí. Cuéntame qué me vas a decir. Si después del cuento.
Welcome, listener, and in Spanish, bienvenido oyente. Let's get the introductions out of the way. My name is Jaime Mayorquín.
And I am Jesenia Chavez. We are your hosts, your guides, your cuento curators for this brand new, mostly Latino, Latina, Latinx storytelling podcast. ¿Qué me cuentas?
¿Qué me cuentas, or at least the idea for it, has been several years in the making. We just finally stopped hesitating. See, I've been a fan of podcasts for a while, especially storytelling podcasts, and I always thought if I was to make my own, it would definitely be one where I'm highlighting my culture. One that's serving as a platform to elevate the voices of the amazing people I've met, the artists of my community, pero también just everyday people with a compelling story to tell.
I've shared my stories a few times at different spaces, including at the Moth, when they had their Cuentos en Español night in March, right before the world shut down. I felt very inspired that night. Nuestra gente quiere contar sus cuentos, and I want to listen.
I do also. I miss that connection of hearing somebody share a personal experience at like a social gathering, a party, an event, and whether it's a friend or someone you've never met before, I usually end up sharing way more than they probably wanted to hear from me, but I just feel that you really get to know someone through those things that we usually don't talk about. And that's the very theme of our first episode. De eso no se habla, or roughly translated, we don't talk about that. So let's just jump into our first story, nuestro primer cuento, by my co-host Jesenia Chavez. A story she simply titled Stealing.
I started stealing when I was 6, 7, or 8 years old. I'm not really sure exactly when, because that's also around the time I was getting abused. We had a lot of babysitters and it all gets fuzzy. It started with these watches that this lady sold at the swap meet. My parents worked there for some time selling jewelry, so we'd get there early on the weekends and set up. Then my brother, sister, and I could wander around. I really wanted one of those digital watches with the cartoon faces you could open up. But I didn't dare ask my parents because I didn't want to cause trouble. And there were 3 of us, and I knew it was an extravagance to ask for a watch. So I stole it, and no one noticed. No one noticed a lot of things back then. They were busy trying to survive, working, battling their own demons. I then started stealing other toys and little things, candies and such. I then moved on to stealing Lisa Frank stickers and Hello Kitty figurines. I stopped for a couple years and then I started up again, but this time at the mall. I'd go with my mom and then grab an item or two, a shirt, some shoes. I love the way my heart would beat and the nerves I would feel. And the best part was getting away with it. I get home and spread out my loot and feel very accomplished. Going to the mall, I'd look around to look for the blind spots. I thought I was a pro, but little did I know that they had undercover security, like 21 Jump Street, but at the mall. I should have known my stealing streak would have to come to an end sometime. At school, at home, I was a good girl, got decent grades, didn't yell at my parents, wasn't having sex, went to church. I even sang in the church choir for a while. But I had my stealing secret. Till one day, I was teaching my younger cousin how to steal, because she wanted free stuff. It was at Mervin's. They stopped us right at the exit. They took our stuff, took us into this room, and called our parents. Luckily, they didn't call the cops, and all we had to do was pay a fine. My parents were pissed. They blamed my cousin. After all, she was the one with the bad grades and the alcoholic dad, and I didn't say anything. I let her take the fall. Not my proudest moment. This incident scared me, but only for a while. I started up again, but this time the stakes were higher because I was 18 and now I could get into serious trouble. But I was in college and I wanted more stuff than what I could afford. I started stealing clothes, books, shampoo, and a bunch of other random shit that I didn't need but I really wanted. I then showed my roommate the ropes. She wanted free stuff too, and we became a dynamic stealing duo. This went on for a bit, but then we got caught, and this time they called the cops, and we had to go to court, pay a fine, do community service, and do an overnight in jail. I, of course, kept this all hidden from my family. It was too embarrassing to admit. I took full responsibility on our court date. We sat there with a court-appointed public defender who explained everything, but I didn't understand a thing, so I just nodded. We signed up for community service, and that year, instead of going home for winter break, we had to stay and work with the city employees, cleaning public bathrooms, cutting weeds, painting the curb red, and other such fun activities. The workers were actually really nice to us, but Crack Bob was the best. It was embarrassing, but at least there weren't many students around. And one day, as me and my friend sat at this park, where we were supposed to be pulling weeds, some Sublime song started blasting from a nearby apartment, and we just burst out laughing at the absurdity of our current situation, all for a couple of sweaters and knickknacks. Then we had to complete our overnight in jail. Luckily, this is Santa Barbara, so that was like going to a resort compared to what I imagined LA jail was like. We drove over, they took our fingerprints, took our mug shots and all that, put us in our own private cell, and we proceeded to sing System of a Down songs, which the guards didn't appreciate, so they told us to shut up. After a couple of hours, we were free to go, and our time in jail was over. I was officially an ex-con. And sometimes I wonder, if that hadn't happened, would I have kept stealing and made it worse? Would I have moved on to bigger things? A bank robbery, a car, Wall Street? I got off on the fact that I looked like I had my shit together, but here I was, a thief. I needed to have a glamorous, ugly secret because the other secrets I carried around were too hard to bear. At least this way I got stuff, and I momentarily felt better. I was fooling everyone. I was fooling myself. I needed to steal. I needed to get away with it. I needed to get caught too, so I could stop feeling like I needed to carry around secrets and shame, and instead carry some hope for myself and my future. Did I steal after that? Maybe, but just a little.
We all have secrets that we keep, skeletons in our closets. The sad thing about that story is knowing that she continues to steal. She just stole my heart with that story. There's beauty in vulnerability. And the more you share, the more you realize that people can relate to you way more than you thought.
And then there are those things that you might not discuss with parents or siblings or even friends because, well, it's just uncomfortable to talk about. Take sex, for example. Growing up, that's what Love Line with Dr. Drew was for. I know my friends and I learned a lot about some stuff early on, but we never discussed it. Just listened and giggled. This is what Sylvia's first poem of the two we will be sharing reminded me of. The unspoken language of best friends, self-censorship, el pecado de hablar del cuerpo y sexo. This is Silvia Chavez's piece, How Does It Feel?
My 13-year-old self knew love through my best friend's accounts. Words exchanged between nighttime flossing. She didn't hold back on details. Size, color, curvature, the way it was, bent to the left, longer than our ex's. I know when he's going to come, she would add. His eyes get really long and glossy, like drunk moons. I didn't know what to say to that, so I listened. I only tell you this so you can know. No one told me. I'd nod my head in gratitude. I only let him rub up against me. My eyes widened. One time, we almost went too far. How does it feel? What did you do? Tell me. But she wouldn't say. Some things you have to learn for yourself.
As we get older, there are some taboo subjects that we do begin to speak about with close family and friends freely. But there are still topics we keep off the table during Thanksgiving because of that asshole primo or that tia sangrona, and I'm not speaking from experience, who might chime in and make everything awkward. Some of those topics include religion, race, politics, especially these days, am I right? Money, masturbation, zodiac signs.
Yeah, see, like for me, I don't talk about my sexuality with my dad. I've never come out to him, and I think that's mainly because I don't date, so that would probably change if I ever met somebody that I really wanted to introduce him to. No, the real reason is that my sister beat me to it. She outed me to him several years ago, so there goes that. And I'm okay with it. I don't hold any grudges. I think it's fine that it wasn't her place, but she still went ahead and told him, and he said that he didn't want to talk about it. So let's just keep going. Everything's fine here. There's nothing to talk about here. I love her very much. So let's just move on.
Okay then, moving on. Relationships with parents definitely have a lot of the eso no se hablaness to them. A lot goes unsaid, unspoken por años. A veces nunca. At times it isn't clear who's protecting who. Which brings us to our next cuento by Maestro Gamin, Mexico, Missouri.
Something curious occurred to me recently about an incident in my past. It happened back where I grew up in a Northern California suburb, about 45 minutes south from the city. The area was mostly middle class, mostly two-parent families. Here, you had the chance to get to know people of every background: Chinese, Brazilian, Anglos. My Latino grandparents from LA lived a block away from me with mi bisabuela, where aunts and uncles and cousins would usually spend Christmas and birthdays. The older white man who lived across the street from us would always shout at my father when we came home, "Hey, neighbor," and he would usually gift us something from his garden. My father has always been older, remarried now and in his 50s. He was raising a 12-year-old son very different from him. He grew up in a town called Mexico in the state of Missouri when, at the time, it was segregated. He never mentioned those times during his childhood until I was much older, but later I learned of the white children who would chase him and how he would have to hide sticks in the bushes to defend himself. I learned about the no black sections of the local movie theater and how he would have to wait outside for his friends to meet up with him, since he wasn't allowed to sit up front where they liked to be. My father always seemed like a downer to me, I think, as a kid. A disciplinarian, he worked as a division manager at Lockheed, and his thing was mathematics and logistics. He was a problem solver, and he liked to drink. I never understood when a group of friends would invite me to sleep over or hang out, how we could be a little apprehensive. Once or twice he would ask me, "How do you know they want you there, David?" I think he was worried most of the time about me getting hurt, and he tried his best to prepare me for harsher realities that would come one day, maybe. I thought he was just being an asshole, but here was a man who, in his 50-some-odd years, as he would say, managed to go from a poor family of black educators coming out of the Depression to the suburbs of California, surrounded by the same type of folks who never considered him before. And here he was raising a family. I could never imagine how odd that must have been to him. So he worried. He worried, and his fear of how or when one day I'd realize that this suburban utopia wasn't made necessarily with me in mind gave everything a hint of pessimism. So I think I was 13. It was the summer before we all went into 7th grade. We didn't know what was ahead, but it was coming, and it would be here before we wanted it to be. That summer was overwhelming. But our day started early. A few of us had gotten together to hang out. We hadn't discovered drinking or smoking yet. It was just friends getting together over the weekend. And we decided to walk down to the local park, which contained a gazebo. And further on the other side of the park was our local elementary school, which had closed down. The rumor was for renovation, though it had been some time and no work had began on it yet. Soon we were there, and something happened. Something made us want to destroy this place. The idea was, well, they're just going to tear it down anyway, and that was all we needed. It was me, a couple of girls that everyone was trying to impress, along with Gerard, Pete, Ray, and a few others. I can't remember. I started kicking in windows, and that was it. Rocks were thrown, more windows broken. Next thing, someone broke the door down, and we were inside the library. Bookshelves knocked down. A voice came over the PA system. Someone had broke into the administration office. I heard my name. We were drunk with choice, and it felt as though we may have even had the right to do what we were doing just then. We honestly didn't see it as bad. We didn't even run away. We continued to hang out close by. It was maybe 40 minutes later in the park that I realized I'd forgotten everything my father had taught me. There were 2 police officers. They seemed to be walking in slow motion over the grass hill towards us. They exited the gazebo, and we saw some girl pointing towards us. I saw the cop wasn't very tall, almost my height. He had blonde hair. He wasn't wearing a hat, but his badge felt very official, and he walked quickly. It was then that I saw the muscles around his face, how taut, how angry they were. His eyes were very blue, and his whole face seemed on fire. He looked possessed. He was completely controlled by emotion. He vibrated, and he walked into my space, and I realized I was looking at pure anger. So, "We've been looking all over for you," he screamed at me. And I saw him make a motion with his arm. I felt this cold sting from my chin to my forehead. He had knocked my cap off my head to humiliate me, but he had hit me in the process. My face was throbbing, but I couldn't really feel it through my shame. I froze. The laughing stopped. There was silence from everyone. We had forgotten about summer. We had forgotten about everything. And now we were just kids who should have known better. I was with 5 or 6 other kids my age, but he'd single me out, the only brown kid. Something I never really had to consider before entered my brain. As a lot of kids started walking home, the police detained me and Pete. And see, Pete had a reputation for fighting, so the police knew who he was. And they just kept us in the back of the squad car for a couple of hours until they decided to drive us home, finally, release us back to our parents' custody. I remember thinking, okay, I guess I'll live in juvenile hall then. I started making plans for a very different life. I was more scared of my father's reaction. The man was hard as a brick when he wanted to be. Every day, for some reason or another, he boiled and he swore and he yelled. I had been hit with a roof shingle across my backside for much less, and I anticipated how he'd look at me, how I would confirm all of his fears up to that moment and see them materializing in real life in front of his eyes. My father answered the door. I heard his baritone voice murmur something to the police officer, and he signed a document. I walked in the house. I couldn't speak. He looked at me and he said, "I think you scared yourself enough today, so I'm not going to punish you. Now go to your room. You're grounded." The next day I told him what happened. I told my father everything about that day, but I left one thing out. I hadn't told him that the cop hit me. It wasn't until I was visiting my parents over holiday vacation, I think I was around 29, when I told him. And my father froze. He looked at me for a while and he said, "You never told me that." And I just said, "I know." What occurred to me recently is that maybe I was protecting him somehow the same way he might have been protecting me for 13 years. Maybe I wanted him to keep believing I felt as safe as he wanted me to. Maybe I didn't want to burden him with any of my 13-year-old trauma and confusion. Maybe I wanted to remain small and out of the way because it seemed safer that way for everybody. If I had to describe myself today, I'd say that I'm more of a pessimist. And my father and I feel like 2 versions of the same person more than ever. Today, my parents live in a small town outside of Sacramento, very Republican. I try to visit every few months. My father's in his 90s, and I feel lucky as hell to have had him all this time.
Our parents have a strong influence on who we grow up to be as adults. Some people even believe that trauma can be passed down generationally through our genes. This story really speaks to me because I remember growing up with my friends and witnessing the abuse of power from the police in our town. And also the idea of just being young and feeling like you can't express yourself in any way against adults. That is not the case at all for our next cuentista, Cristal Gonzalez, in this piece entitled Ivon Esunaputa.
6:30 a.m. Ale and I eagerly wait to hear the beep 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 of Papi's troquita to run outside to meet him. If we waited for the third beep, he would say, usa la cabeza, mamacita, as he pointed to his forehead. This particular morning, I was feeling pretty good, and we made it out rapidito by the second beep. Buenos días, papi. Buenos días, he replied. Papá's troquita siempre será uno de mis lugares favoritos. There's something so comforting about the smell of dirt, cigarro, and sweat. We made our way out of Main Street, away from the oversaturated, shitty apartment complex to Corralitos, the outskirts of Watsonville, where most of the apple orchards are located. Donde por la mañana se puede ver el sol despertándose, dejándose ver solo entre las ramas de los árboles, besando la tierra como si fuera la primera vez. It was a warm summer day, a really hot summer day, during the tail end of my summer break. It had only been a year since Papa had moved out and moved in with the bruja, so any opportunity to spend time with Papa was cherished. This was the time when Papa was living in the house between two apple orchards. The one that had the pond with the little ranitas and the rana eggs that looked like giant sperm swimming around in círculos como locos buscando salida? Yeah, that house. It was about to be lunch break. Before Dad went inside to eat, we went for a quick run to la Marqueta del Chino, cerca de la casa de Papá. Agarren 3 cosas, dice Papi. We got some chips, water, y unas paletas. Mine was de coco, Ale's de limón. We drove back to the rancho, Ale already enjoying her paleta. I waited to open mine. Papá pregunta, ¿seguras que no tienen hambre? I discreetly turned to Ale and made a gesture of dying, with my tongue out and my eyes rolled back. No, papi, we both answered. We didn't like going inside with Dad's new wife. Besides, at that time, I was still very convinced that she would poison us, if and when given the opportunity. So when I was with Papi, I was never hungry if she was cooking. Dad went inside. Ale and I stayed outside with the ranas, la tierra, y nuestras paletas. Next to Papi's house, there was a large water tank. I'm not sure whose idea it was, but instead of eating my paleta, I used it to write what was on my mind. My little sister, standing feet away from me, didn't say a word. She sat near and watched my masterpiece unfold. My paleta became my expressive instrument, just like Carol in the purple crayon. Only that my paleta wasn't purple. It was white cocoa-flavored milk-based Michoacana paleta. I only had one chance to get the letter right. Each letter right. There was no room for error. The day was hot and my crayon was melting at a fast rate. I could feel the milk dripping through my fingers. At last, it was done. Ivon Esunaputa, I wrote. And the heat waves gave my art piece an extra pop that I wasn't expecting, but delighted it turned out that way. I took a couple of steps back and joined Ale, who was finishing up the last bit of her paleta and moving on to the chips. We both nodded our heads with approval. It looked great, all in caps, nice and bold. I read it again. Ivon Esunaputa, period. Perfect. That was a statement. Before I could really relish my accomplishment, en eso pasa un trabajador de mi papá. Le llamaban el payasito, porque en México con eso se ganaba la vida. Y al llegar a los Estados Unidos también intentó su carrera de payaso, pero no tuvo suficiente fama. No le pareció gracioso mi propaganda y corrió rapidito a decirle a mi papá. Papá salió ya algo molesto. Papá no era de carácter fuerte, pero venía hacia nosotros acomodándose los pantalones y enderezándose. ¿Tú escribiste eso? Sí. Yo ya estaba preparada para la cachetada. Papá lights a cigarette and stares at the water tank for what seemed a lifetime. Luego he walked back and forth, from water tank to sperm puddle, about a mile's worth. Suddenly, he grabs the water hose and points it to the water tank for a few minutes. Nada. Again. Nada. El sol stood in solidarity with me. Después de 3 intentos, se dio por vencida. ¿Qué significa eso?, preguntó. Ivon Esunaputa, I said. ¿Por qué, Cristal? ¿Por qué? ¿Porque es cierto? Ale gas behind me. Silence. Papá lights yet another cigarette. No dice nada. No dice nada, porque de eso no se habla.
This podcast will at times be unapologetically bilingual. There will be patches here and there where some of you will not understand, and we're at peace with that. You can just Google it. You'll finally understand how some of our non-English speaking parents have felt in this country, since this is a pretty parent-heavy episode. We don't do this to monolingual shame anyone. Maybe some light virtue signaling and dog whistling, but we're all about acceptance. No shaming here. That includes fetish and kink shaming. I mean, everyone has some sexy stuff they like that you may or may not find strange. Cada quien que no. And with that said, coincidentally and not intentionally at all, let's go ahead and listen to a second poem by Silvia Chavez. It is titled Faviola.
Faviola with the red puckered lips and round smooth hips loves lingerie. But her husband says they don't have enough money. Faviola with a master's degree, an SUV, and 2 small kids says she loves them just the same. Little league and a soccer dad, cooks and cleans, says he's a wonderful father, and he is. Faviola with the long curly hair and curvy calves comes home early to confirm a suspicion. She's found lingerie in closets and under beds. Nice stuff too, the kind he says they can't afford. Faviola creeps upstairs, sure not to make a sound. She hears music and smells the soft sexual scents of cologne. That much she expected. She's determined to put a face to whomever and whoever would dare to take her man and her bed, and unabashedly her man in her bed, with only one question drowning all her other thoughts. She pushes the bedroom door open and finds her husband in front of their full-length mirror, dressed in nothing but lingerie. The good stuff too, the kind he says they can't afford. Finger and toenails were polished a bright scarlet red, matching the brassiere and the shade his skin was turning as his eyes widened in surprise. Faviola with the big bouncy tits and smooth curvy lips runs downstairs. Rogelio chases to explain. I love you and the kids, I really do. I just like to wear this stuff, that's all. I love how it makes me feel. Faviola with the red puckered lips and round smooth hips says she loves him just the same till she doesn't.
Pobrecito Rogelio. His secret came out, and and it changed things. Faviola couldn't get past it, and that's too bad. But again, cada quien. I believe this piece was inspired by something that Sylvia either overheard or got from friends while chismeando. As storytellers and writers, we learn to mine from material from everywhere around us. It doesn't always have to be about our childhood or about the family, because sometimes writing about family secrets doesn't go over well con la familia. Our final cuento is a personal narrative by Rich Villegas Jr. It is titled Chillón.
I was born to a bound, tied-up woman. The nurses secured my mother's hands to the hospital bed as she was pushing me out of her body. She was without drugs and alone because papis were not allowed in the delivery room with mommies in those days, and epidurals were not yet standard. It was a summer morning in Boyle Heights in the 1970s, Lincoln Hospital to be precise, when my 22-year-old mother pushed me crying out into this world. She was 63 years old when I just by chance asked her out of curiosity, what happened that morning? That's when she matter-of-factly revealed that the nurses had tied her hands down with straps. She made it sound so ordinary and routine, as if they had used a scrunchie to pull her hair out of her face into a ponytail. She also said it with the insinuation that I should remember what happened because after all I was there. But of course I didn't remember. My older aunt, who was listening to us and who had had 4 children of her own, chimed in, "Ay, man, I used to hate when they did that." Apparently, tying pregnant women down was standard operating procedure back then. On that July morning, I came wailing into this world. My mother's hands were tied down as my lungs painfully inflated with air. I've been a Qiyon ever since. She says she also remembers one particular episode when I was sick with whooping cough. I was a baby and so ill that I was clawing at her neck, crying in agony, seeking relief, but my young mother was alone and helpless and could offer none. It was the middle of the night and my father was at work. She was carless and didn't know what to do but cradle me, rock me in her arms as I writhed and sobbed in torment. I cried when I was hungry, scared, necio, sick, when possessed by nightmares or earaches, and then that one time that my father tried to kill my mother. I was 7 and we were at a family gathering. I spied my parents walking alone through a dark hallway, moving away from the party toward the back bedroom. I thought they were kissing, so I secretly followed them, delighted by spying on their romance. I thought we were all being so very sneaky and naughty. When we reached the bedroom, I realized they were actually arguing and that my father had taken his hands to my mother's neck. He was strangling her. She was choking and gurgling as he released her and let her fall onto the bed. She was then on her knees in front of me. She had caught some of her breath, and now we were crying together like a pair of wounded children. Some of my metiche cousins had popped their heads in to investigate the ruckus. When they saw our pathetic tableau, they ran to sound the alarm. My aunts and uncles rushed into the room to separate my father from my mother. The celebration had turned into a bona fide Mexican mitote with screaming women and men getting physical with each other. My grandmother, who was raven-haired then and fierce when angry, lambasted my drunk father for his violence against her daughter. I saw her scolding him in flawless Spanglish, looking up into his face with a pointed finger. Then she turned toward me and offhandedly yelled, "Why didn't you say anything?" I melted into a puddle of shameful tears for my incompetence. It's taken me 4 decades, but I'm finally saying something. We're not supposed to write about family matters. I've been criticized on social media for telling my stories and making my parents look bad with their own actions. When I shared my coming out story on National Coming Out Day 2 years ago, I included the fact that my parents kicked me out of the house. Family members admonished me for sharing such information. One of my aunts called me mean and selfish and accused me of seeking pity. My parents are beloved in my family. Their godchildren and nieces fervently protect their good name. Making the private public, airing dirty laundry, conjuring the skeletons out of the closet to dance in front of everyone is verboten in our tribes. I don't speak with my family anymore. Their conservative hypocrisies on top of the many times they have hurt me have become too much to bear. I refuse to respect the old familial hierarchies and realize that being a writer and being an obedient son may not be compatible anymore. I've chosen freedom over family, and I've come to favor writing over crying. In George Lopez's autobiography entitled Why Are You Crying?, he talks about how his parents abandoned him and how he had to go live with a cruel and neglectful grandmother who would often denigrate the dark, fat, ugly little boy that he was. The old woman would often ask him in an irritated way, "Why are you crying, cabron?" But he knew there was no proper answer to satisfy her question. It was more of a complaint than an actual inquiry into his well-being. He later turned that question into a punchline for one of his comedy specials, and he turned his traumatic childhood into a successful sitcom. There is no George Lopez show without recounting the pain of his childhood. I remember watching the camp classic Mommy Dearest with my own mommy. We were both enthralled by the story of Hollywood legend Joan Crawford's maltreatment of her adopted children. In a movie with such multiple memorable scenes, the one that stands out for me is the very end of the film when the family lawyer reveals that the wealthy and famous Miss Crawford purposefully left her children out of her will with no financial provisions. Her son Christopher looks towards his sister and remarks, "As usual, she has the last word." And Christina responds, "Does she?" The ominous music begins, and you're supposed to realize that the movie is based on the book Christina Crawford wrote to exact revenge on her mother. As a little boy, I understood then how powerful writing can be. Writing can be an act of retribution, of justice seeking. Writing is a reckoning parents or family members rarely see coming. I feel sorry for a Latino family with a writer born into its midst. They have a powerful witness among them, taking names and notes, and they don't even know it. Polish Nobel Prize-winning author Czesław Milosz said, "When a writer is born into a family, the family is finished." Writer and theorist Gloria Anzaldúa has expressed being terrified about turning her mother into a villain and betraying her by writing about her in her essays. The Chicana author identifies with the Aztec goddess Coyoxauhqui, the daughter who almost killed her serpent-headed mother, but was slain by her bastard brother instead, chopped into pieces and made into the moon. Anzaldúa reckons that writing is a similar act of betrayal and sacrifice. We're not supposed to write about our families. It's shameful and disrespectful. It's insolence and dishonor. It's an act filed somewhere between disloyalty, tattletaling, chisme, talking too much, and journalism. You're supposed to shut up and behave like obedient children, even once you are of age. But children cry. And crying has to be our first form of writing. It's our first form of communication, our pre-verbal announcements of hunger, of want, of wetness, of fear and anger, of protest. Crying is our first language. Then comes the sitting up, the holding up of your big wobbly baby head, the crawling, the walking, the singing, the talking, the asking of too many questions, until eventually, through schooling, through education, that great divider of families, comes the writing. It's the opportunity for all the Chillones and Chillonas to get their chance to tell their stories and account for their lives. With apologies to the late, great Audre Lorde, it's the transformation of our crying into language and action. Why are you crying becomes why are you writing? When I last spoke with my grandmother about 6 months ago, her hair was now as white as lies. I've been a writer for a while, and I know she holds me in suspicion. She answers my questions, but is not forthcoming or verbose. I was trying to explain to her my career transition from school teacher to full-time writer. I told her about the TV show I sold and the book I was writing, but I'm not sure she understood how writing could be a paid profession or how I could earn my new livelihood. Actually, I don't know if she even cared about the logistics of all that because her first reaction was, "You're not writing about me, are you?" I told a white lie and said, "No, I'm not writing about you, Grandma. Not yet, anyways. I'm working on other memories. When I was about 4 years old, I was at my cousin's birthday and I began to cry. Once again, uncontrollably for no reason. It was a children's birthday party replete with cousins, cake, and candy. There was a piñata and fried chicken, potato salad, carne asada, and beverages for all. Aunts and uncles were swathed in pastels, big collars, bell-bottoms, and smiles. There was laughter and joy. But there I was, sobbing as if I was in pain or I had been abandoned. My mother couldn't figure out what the hell was wrong with me. I was fed, clean, safe at a party. What's wrong? What's the problem? Embarrassed, exasperated, frustrated, I'm sure, she hauled me into the bathroom. She kneeled down in front of me like she would on that day my father tried to strangle her. Our eyes met. A beautiful, big-haired, bell-bottom, wedge-heeled Chicana mother who loved me, fed me eggs and weenies, dressed me in tiny suits and plaid shirts, bought me toy cars and wax crayons, who read books to me all the time, was at the end of her rope when she grabbed me by my shoulders and asked in desperation, "What's wrong, mijo? What's wrong? Why are you crying?" It's taken me so very long to come up with an honest answer. "Why are you crying?" she pleaded to me while on her knees. "I'm crying because I don't know how to write yet, but when I learn, I'm going to write about you and Papi, and everybody's hearts will be broken."
I cried when I first read this piece. I'm a Chillona to the max. Richard reveals the complexity of family, the collective delusion for love and acceptance from those that raised us. With lots of communities of color, it's very much a village. And, sometimes that village can turn on you when you tell the truth.
Starting a project like this, a podcast, you're left feeling very vulnerable. There's self-doubt, there's panic, but honestly, for the first time in a while, the excitement overpowered the paralyzing fear I usually feel. It's because we're extremely excited to be bringing you these cuentos. This is our first episode, and so there's going to be, of course, some audio issues, especially with collecting these stories remotely. And while editing, there's been some adjustment to hearing my own voice repeatedly. I'm confident it's going to get easier, that we're going to get better, so please stick with us. We're still finding our tone, our style, our voice. We're trying different forms of storytelling. Live storytelling is something that we hope to get back to sometime next year. We're planning on hosting some live events. So stay alive, stay safe, wear your masks, because we do want to hear from all of you eventually. My co-hosts and I are both LA-based. We are both first generation of Mexican descent, but it's important to us to eventually fill this podcast with all the diversity de nuestra gente latina. Every color, age, gender, ability, wherever you live in the world, except maybe Miami-Dade County, because, well, you know what you did, and I am just kidding. This is not a very political podcast. We just want stories that make us laugh or think or feel connected as humans. And the reason we want them to be primarily Latino or from Latinx folks is because there is an absence of our people, de nuestra gente, on TV and film, and it's good to call that out, but I think equally or more importantly, it's important to do something about it, to create. I think that is what we're trying to do with this, and we are only getting started.
And that is why our next episode's theme is Nacimiento, stories of births, beginnings, or however our storytellers decide to interpret this theme. On behalf of Que Me Cuentas, I'd like to thank our cuentistas for bravely sharing in our first episode.
I'd also like to really thank my longtime friend Gonzalez for giving us that push that finally got us going on this, and also to Dan Hughley from Focusrite for helping us out with some equipment. Our theme music was created for us by Alfredo Avila, and some of the additional music that we used in the episode is by local band Aparato.
For more information on them and the podcast, visit our pages on Facebook or Instagram at Que Me Cuentas Pod.
Please help us out by rating, reviewing, and subscribing. That's very important. If you enjoyed this podcast, the plan is that you tell 5 friends, and then they can tell 5 friends, and it can work like a pyramid scheme, like an Aztec pyramid scheme. If you're still here, thank you, Latinos, Latinas, and Latinxes, for listening to the very first episode of Que Me Cuentas. Hasta la próxima.
¿Qué camino a seguir? ¿Qué me cuentas tú? ¿Qué me cuentas tú?